Greetings, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the second installment of Platforms and Pandemics, our web discussions of the national political conventions in 2020. Just a couple of house cleaning notes before we begin. I first want to explain a little bit that we don't normally do all white guy panels at TNR. We do try in good faith to represent a diversity of identities in our discussions. The backstory here is a little convoluted because we originally, you may recall that there was a long time when the Republican National Convention was slated to actually happen as a traditional live event, and it moved from North Carolina down to Florida provisionally, and it so happens we have a contributing editor, Adam Weinstein, who's based in Florida, and he's friends with Jeb Lund, who's a very accomplished political writer in Florida. So somehow we managed to talk them into incurring the great health risk and psychological risk of traveling to Jacksonville to cover the RNC Live. Of course, since then, in a rare departure from form, saner voices prevailed within the Republican National Committee, and they decided to violate the Hatch Act in the most aggressive ways possible and repatriate the proceedings to the White House and other federal properties. So Adam and Jeb were greatly disappointed in their quest to stalk the white grievance spectacle of the RNC and its Florida habitat. So we invited them to participate in this postmortem. And of course, Walter Shapiro is our, very accomplished, very experienced campaign reporter who's now on his 11th presidential campaign. It would be an act of gross negligence on our part not to include him. And I also happen to have been born a white guy. So just wanted to get that explained a bit before proceeding. The other thing I wanted to tell folks is we're going to talk for about 45 minutes today. And at the end of that discussion, we'll be taking questions from the audience. If you're on Zoom, which I assume you must be since I'm on Zoom, there's a Q&A button that's sort of just to the left of the or in the farthest right of all the functionalities you have in the center of the screen. And please submit us questions there as they occur to you. So I've already sort of introduced our panel, but quickly to review, Adam Weinstein is a contributing editor for The New Republic. Jeb Lund is a political writer based in Florida who's published at UK Guardian, used to be part of the great Gawker Colossus, RIP. And Walter Shapiro, as I said, is The New Republic's campaign reporter. Welcome, everyone. Now that we've had a sort of cognitively demanding 4 days of speeches from the Republicans making the case for Trump's reelection, I sort of wanted to actually start by quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sage of Concord, who described basically all of American cultural life in the 19th century as an argument between the party of hope and the party of fear. And I think, in the terms of discourse that these two conventions have bequeathed us, I've seen as stark an illustration of that Emersonian analysis as I remember in our politics, certainly. Joe Biden cast himself as an emissary of the forces of light coming out of a long period of darkness and decline. Donald Trump sees the specter of civic anarchy rising up from the nation's streets, and the Democratic Party as eager abettors of socialist, Antifa, violent chaos. So I guess, I want to start off this discussion by asking you, and I guess, Walter, I will defer to you first. Is this on the Republican Trump side, where there, is a vision of embattled American verities and property, that seems a little exaggerated, and especially at a moment when a shooter who had been in the first row of a Trump rally in Iowa, 17-year-old gunman killed two protesters in Kenosha over the protests there. How is this message likely to land, in what's traditionally, the demographic that both conventions try to pitch of, sort of undecided or independent voters, people who are not sure just yet how they're going to vote. Will they vote their fears over their hopes?
Really quickly, if there's one group the Democrats were pitching their convention to, it was to maximize African American turnout, because turnout among African Americans was one of the reasons why Hillary lost the 3 key states in 2016. For the Republicans, it was trying to maximize evangelical turnout, at the same time winning back suburban voters, particularly suburban women who are conservative economically, but are appalled by Trump's conduct, his language, and the way he conducts himself as president. And the whole point of the fear is both aimed at physical fear of crime and economic fear of plunging property values from disorder.
Right.
One of the big changes is, and it's something you can't poll for because it's happened too fast and this is such a turbulent week, is the fact that in sports mad America, both the basketball leagues, both men and women, plus the baseball leagues have come out defiantly and unequivocally on the side of the protesters. So rather than Joe Biden standing alone with the anarchists and the protesters, he's now metaphorically linked arm in arm with LeBron James in a Black Lives Matter t-shirt and baseball stars like Mookie Betts, who led the Dodgers to not play their game last night. And I think this is a major sea change, particularly in a world where, as Donald Trump knows, sports matter, which is why we had recent former Notre Dame football coach Lou Holtz commenting on the theological significance of Joe Biden's Catholicism.
No, exactly. And I think you raise a really interesting point. And sports is a, something that Trump has been literally invested in the past in the USFL and WWE. But it also holds a great deal of symbolic significance. He was able to muster this great cultural war attack on the solitary figure of Colin Kaepernick a couple of years ago to get Trump's base revved up. And now, yeah, I think that's an important symbolic, and I think it's, events have been sort of uncontrolled this week, but I think it has been delivered on the part of the athletes to put this message of solidarity out there right in the teeth of the Republican convention. Jeb, when we were talking ahead of the call, you had sort of mentioned that solidarity is kind of the kryptonite to the Trump strategy. Can you explain a little more about that?
Well, I think you already started to get to it, which is that, Colin Kaepernick is an individual. As an individual, there could have been some part of his story that led him down the wrong path and led him to read the wrong people and conclude the wrong things. But especially seeing the solidarity of baseball strike, which is still coded as essentially a white sport. NBA has
traditionally a conservative sport,
Right. Yeah. Well, it's measurably, unlike every other sport, you can quantify like individual achievement. And so if you're part of that conservative narrative of I have triumphed over 99% of other human beings, I am a self-actualized person, baseball reifies that in a way that the NBA doesn't. But there is such a media ecosystem that already exists to blame players and exculpate ownership, and in fact, it seeps into the mainstream. And you saw that with the headlines of the players are going on a boycott. Well, how are they going to boycott it? They are basketball. How are they going to choose not to obtain basketball?
They can't not by themselves, right?
So I don't know, like at least among Trump voters, I don't know how transcendent or moving that can be. But just the act of having entire teams to absorb the criticism and just having white players who are at least maybe they're not vocal, but they're silently standing in support. That,
or even someone like Clayton Kershaw, who, is an evangelical, and I think his politics are pretty solidly conservative, said, the Dodgers will play when Mookie Betts plays, which that shocked me to hear. That is a statement of solidarity. It's also interesting, Trump's very long speech last night culminated in this sort of vision of American heroism, and he conjured the original settlers of the continent who, overcame adversity, the elements, and the native population. And, he ticked off all these, symbols of the conquest of the West, Davy Crockett, Buffalo Bill, which was probably not a wise choice if you pay attention to actual American history. But that's all by way of saying, yes, there is this heroic narrative at the center of the Trump pitch at this point. It's not just that, the Democrats are the Trojan horse socialist party who are going to wreck your property values, but we're on the side of the heroic cops and first responders. We are the heroic responders to COVID, which is quite a remarkable rhetorical stretch at this moment. Which actually was the next thing I wanted to raise. But I do think, there is this rather powerful narrative of people who are, secular heroes in American pop culture rising up as one, saying, this is no longer acceptable. The Doc Rivers speech that went viral a couple of days ago, I thought was, I wish somehow that the Democrats had him speaking during last week's convention, because it was, just very powerful. He said, African Americans love this country, and this country just never loves them back. But to return to the COVID part of this pitch, and Adam, I'll ask you this. It is like many aspects of the DNC spectacle, an alternate universe sort of account of things, that, Trump acted decisively to shut down the borders, right? When news of the pandemic was emerging in China. And the most bizarre part of the Trump speech was, he did this sort of counterfactual of, had Joe Biden, been in charge, we would have lost hundreds of thousands of more lives because he wouldn't have done the things I've done. And I was just like, that is classic kind of big lie messaging that I think we have to acknowledge is an authoritarian to fascist rhetorical strategy. And you've written a lot about this uncomfortable overlap of Trumpism and fascism. And I just wondered, I was thinking of you as I was watching that part of the speech.
That's the future of the Republican Party, right? We've been optimized for a certain kind of authoritarianism. And look, I think one of the reasons that, first of all, it's amazing that we are beginning to have that conversation. It is beginning to be mainstream to discuss whether we have vestiges of a fascist or an authoritarian administration in the United States. And it used to be just beyond the pale to even be able to say that. And part of the reason, as I've said in the pieces, is when you say fascist in the United States, people say Hitler. Right. And I can make a pretty persuasive case that we've got a lot of Hitlerists, National Socialists, German Workers' Party ideals going on in the Republican mainstream and in the Trump administration right now. You don't have to go there. We can talk about, parallels to the Italian fascisti. If you really want to get saucy with these Republicans who are angry about Bolsheviks, I can talk about how Stalinist the Trump administration is. We just came out of a 70-minute Trump speech, which, I mean, it really is
an authoritarian trait. Yes.
Yeah, and I was actually shocked to find out that it was a few minutes shorter than his 2016 American Carnage speech. I think it just felt longer to everybody because it hit all of the same notes we'd seen for 4 days and 4 years, right. And also because it was teleprompter.
Right, and as Walter was saying, you know, it was at least tonally massaged to make Trump seem not like this scary, impulsive, you know, you don't know what he's going to say or do next figure.
Yeah, but one of the things, I mean, you brought up at the very beginning these dueling notions of fear and hope. And I think what's interesting is, you know, we could spend several hours talking about all of the fear and all of the craziness and how they're trying to, you know, cynically scare a certain kind of white suburbanite woman that they have coveted ever since the George W. Bush era, right. That I don't think is going that way. But we can talk about the hope as well. It's interesting about how they position hope and who hope is given to. The one thing that I noticed through all 4 nights, but particularly in the first night, is the offer that they're putting on the table for the American people after 4 years of ruling, mind you, is buy a ticket in the Trump lottery.
Right.
You need to participate in his successes. You need to accept everything he does and says, and in return, you might be a winner in the next year's magnanimity sweepstakes. He had
also, you know, the model by which he governed. You know, he has staffed his administration, right? He is, you know, it's very transactional, and it's very clear that, you know, you fall in with a great leader and you benefit, and if you dissent, you are punished and expelled, you know.
We should probably talk a little bit, well, I mean, we don't have to here, but I think that one of the interesting things is that, like, the ethos behind a reality TV show, behind like The Apprentice, when you apply it to the Oval Office, yes, is a totalitarian frame.
Yeah, well, say more about that. I mean, it's basically all about appeasing the central figure, and he will fire you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it starts from the assumption that whatever he wants is business best practices. Whatever he wants is ethical and presidential. I mean, to me, as somebody who admittedly did not live through the Nixon administration, this has all felt like a large Republican reclamation project of getting back to, well, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And sort of extending that into every aspect of a comprehensive ideology.
Yeah, that is, I think, a really good statement of, I think, what should be clear to everyone by now, the ambition of the Trump presidency is, and what the real, you know, case for re-election is. What's also distressing, I was thinking as you were talking, is, as was the case with The Apprentice, Trump is able to very adroitly exploit the media's expectations that, you know, because he is president, the media time and time again, you know, goes for you know, is the Charlie Brown going for the Lucy position football, and, you know, takes the position that because Trump is saying it, it is presidential and it has to be taken seriously. Even the exercise of fact-checking Trump's claims, which has become a Herculean and somewhat discursively pointless exercise now, is sort of predicated on the idea that, well, if we point out these lies, maybe he'll stop. There's a failure to understand that, you know, the lies are part of, you know, are integral to the pitch. And Jeb, since you have a sideline and you have a podcast devoted to a very peculiar television subgenre, maybe you can illuminate this weird dynamic of how the, you know, the reality TV presidency is morphing into something, you know, very, very scary.
Well, I think it goes along with something that Adam said. I mean, so you're being coy about this for people who don't know. David J. Roth, a contributor to the New Republic, and I seriously review Hallmark original movies, and we try to be funny about it. but we take them at their word and what they're trying to create. And a lot of that universe is based on validating the skill set that you have to be a homebody. It's taking like the demographic signifiers of what your education level or what your suburban confines might be, and then taking the things that already make you and saying, well, that if that had been applied to the real world, if you had not been a homemaker, you would have been a CEO. And I think the Trump administration, or at least this convention, the only way they could really do that was by to a certain extent, like what Adam said, saying, well, you can win the lottery, but also that we're all implicated in danger together, right? So like the theme for if I had to give it one sentence, it would be, we're turning the tide in Stalingrad. Like that was the message of the convention. Like we already won the war, but we're not losing it anymore. Right. And you're part of that. And by like implicating you in a struggle you weren't aware of, then you find some sort of kinship with people who obviously like on a power scale are so far above you.
Well, that's very interesting because, we were talking in one of the magazine meetings about the McCloskeys and, like, how is it that a party that's ostensibly, a conservative populist, sort of sticking it to the, forces of globalizing capitalism has adopted as, a key symbol of the struggle ahead, this incredibly privileged power couple of St. Louis attorneys who live in a sort of glorified palazzo, or chintzy palazzo, I guess, more aptly, as, tribunes of the plain people. And to me, I grew up in Iowa. My sister went to Washington University briefly. And I actually understand that part. I think a lot of, people whose economic life chances are foreshortened in other ways in that part of the country look at the McCloskeys as aspirational role models. They want a palazzo, and they certainly want to be out front of it, armed when Black protesters go by.
Well, presumably, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Presumably, if armed vigilantism is important to these hypothetical voters, they also want to practice proper muzzle and trigger discipline. And this is the part of the McCloskeys that I don't understand. Those people obviously have touched weapons like maybe 3 times before they went out and threatened a bunch of people next to their lawn. And if you can persuasively make the argument as you are, Chris, that in terms of socioeconomics, they might represent an aspirational model for some people. Those people also should remember that they came from a gun culture and a religious culture of responsibility. I was raised in this culture as a 3rd generation gun collector. And I instantly look at these people who believe that there are no responsibilities that are attendant with their Second Amendment rights. And that's the core of this party now. It's not simply self-protection, self-reliance. These are our ideals, the American individual.
Right.
It's licensed to be a reckless asshole.
No, it's true. It's the post-Heller vision of gun ownership, right?
I think also the converse. I'm sorry, Walter.
I want to add about the McCloskeys. In somewhere around 2016, the humorist Fran Lebowitz said very smartly about Trump. Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person.
A rich person, exactly.
Which is that the idea of, if you are living a marginal life, your idea of being rich is not a discrete shingled house on Nantucket with views of the beach. No, it is gold-plated faucets everywhere, or a palazzo in St. Louis. That is your idea. It is the crudity of the Trump wealth that makes it so appealing to those people who don't have it.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And it extends to his rhetorical style. I think he, is channeling things that a lot of, if you're a, sort of regional burger in the Midwest, you can't say a lot of the things that Trump says about people who aren't white, or about, political correctness or cancel culture or whatever it is. And he is channeling a lot of that. And again, I think to degree of success that we should not be surprised by, but we still are.
Chris, you mentioned cancel culture, and one of the things, I have a piece on the convention that just went up on the New Republic website, and what you're getting now is the writer's remorse of, oh, I should have also said that. In this case, it is a strange history of this convention that the world's worst pandemic in a century is discussed less often than the semi-mythical cancel culture.
Yeah.
Or the cancel culture ignoring the fact that Donald Trump is out to cancel everyone, particularly people of color or any woman, starting with Megyn Kelly in 2016, who challenges him on anything.
Well, Adam, I think maybe you picked up on this, or like that this might occur to you, but I always think of when they say cancel culture, I always think of that as part of their dyad of the only amendments that count, right? Mm-hmm. The Second Amendment is there to guarantee the first. So if you can establish that the First Amendment is just like by default from every, institution in the United States is under attack, then that's the way you get somebody like the McCloskeys to feel like they're part of the ongoing conflict.
It's a weird little data point, but when I was growing up, my father was an NRA member. My grandfather was an NRA life member. He died in 1989, but he continues to be a life member, and I continue to receive his magazine subscriptions. But the NRA had two magazines back then. One was Man at Arms for the distinguishing collector of antiques, and one was the American Rifleman, which was more modern, more practical stuff, along with a little bit of politics and some columns like Anecdotal Armed Citizens. When Ackerman, the marketing company, got involved in the NRA, in the last couple of years, they launched a third magazine called America's First Freedom. Second Amendment, First Freedom.
First Freedom, all right. That says a great deal about the spectacle we just witnessed over the past week. Walter, I did want to follow up with you about, the other key theme of the embattled suburbs, which is, again, there isn't much in the way of coded language or dog whistles left in the Republican Party, but saying that Joe Biden is going to demolish the suburbs is a way of saying he's going to let Black people in. I was getting, this was a reassuring moment, I guess, because I had a flashback to 2018 when the immigrant caravan was the big scare tactic, the big culture war, thing that was going to mobilize the same base. And you saw it all over Tucker Carlson and Fox News and Breitbart. And it didn't work. And overnight, after the election, you heard nothing more about the immigrant caravan.
Well, no, what I remember, I think the Times did an interview with a woman in Wisconsin in 2018 who was just totally scared by the immigrant caravans.
Yes.
And he kept saying, I and my friends, we have houses on the lake up north, and those houses are really not cared for in the winter. And I'm really afraid the immigrant caravans will move in. And since, as we all know, even if you were part of an immigrant caravan, there's no safer place to go from the Rio Grande into northern Wisconsin.
At that point, you may as well just keep going to Canada where you'll get health care,
Right.
Yeah, but there was a level of craziness that underlies this. But it's also protecting the suburbs has a long history.
Yes, of course.
About a week before the California primary in which Robert Kennedy was assassinated in '68, he had a radio debate with his rival Eugene McCarthy on the left. And part of the debate pivoted around Kennedy claiming that McCarthy supported open housing and that they would be busing in Black people into Orange County. There are many, many admirable things about Bobby Kennedy's last and only presidential race in 1968. But I really think that anyone who worships at the shrine of Bobby Kennedy might want to airbrush those 15 or 20 minutes of that debate.
I'm sure that
these fears of property values go back probably to the 40s and 50s, when there was a great outmigration from America's major cities for baby boomer children like myself,
right.
so that they can grow up in green suburbs.
Right, and white suburbs. Since you mentioned 1968, Walter, I did want to touch on what's already emerging, I think, and had, back when the protests started after George Floyd's killing, of a favorite pundit talking point that we are seeing, the resurgence of 1968, 52 years later. This annoys me on many levels. I was a, semi-trained academic historian. History just doesn't work that way. Things don't repeat in parallel fashion. They may echo and rhyme. But I think, it's important to draw out some key distinctions. And you mentioned one already, Walter, the fact that we have this kind of broad uprising of athletes, celebrity athletes, in response to this was something that was not thinkable in 1968 for all kinds of reasons. We did have the two Olympic Black Power protesters, but they were in what we were earlier discussing as the Kaepernick mold of individuals who could be sort of shrugged off. So Walter, since you brought up that cursed year, I figured I will throw to you first. What can we learn from 1968 that is?
What I want to do is rise to the defense of Richard Milhouse Nixon.
All right. Good luck to you, sir.
The point is that Nixon's rhetoric was always understated.
Yeah.
He really never did explicit racial appeals. In fact, by 68, even George Wallace didn't.
Right.
That the fact is
national support. So yeah, there are
Trump's language. The saying to members of the squad, go back to where you came from, is something that in 68 would never have come out of Nixon or George Wallace's lips. Perhaps Spiro Agnew on a bad day. But
right, exactly. We both went to this.
That's number one. Number two, it is hard to exaggerate how much America was knocked off of its moorings by the fact that in 5 years, we had 3 wrenching assassinations. The 2 Kennedys, plus Martin Luther King, of course, which just puts everything in a different level. And for all of Trump's talk about carnage, we were losing 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers a year in Vietnam.
Yeah, that is a huge.
And at a point when we did not have the Trump economic collapse, that by 1969, unemployment for most of that year was under 4%, at really a level that Trump only matched up until COVID arrived. So I have lots of trouble with the analogies, but my biggest trouble is that Richard Nixon was crude, racist, anti-Semitic in private. And we know the private from the White House tapes. But in public, he tried to maintain as much as humanly possible the dignity of the presidency.
Right, and there was also a Republican Party that was not a ideological cult of personality around him. There were, still liberal wing. There was a McCluskey who ran as an anti-war primary opponent to
72.
In 70. Oh, that's right, 72. But yes, it was a very different Republican Party, a very different country, and a very different economy. And I think you hit those points well. That said, I guess apart from just intellectual laziness, what propels a lot of the speculative talk is, 68 was literally violent year of clashing ideas about the country, but it was also a very hard fought close election campaign. And, there was a sense in which things were spiraling out of control, and the country's racial divide was kind of critical to that. And I did think, you know, putting my own political rooting interests aside, if I had to grade speeches, I would say like Nikki Haley's speech was actually well sort of conceived and executed. It argued that America is not a racist country, which is something that I think both the Trump base very much wants to hear for self-interested reasons, but is one of the few occasions where I felt like a speaker on the platform was reaching out to an undecided or independent voter, saying, you know, we understand there are problems, but we're a good country. We're going to be inclusive. We're going to, you know, my life story, of course, illustrates all this. So
Scott illustrated the same thing on the first night.
Right.
Yeah, I just have to jump in because I watched all of the first night and I watched Nikki Haley and it drove me insane because they did bring out a couple of establishment Republicans who themselves were positioned as winners of the Trump lottery, right, who offered these conventional platitudes, sort of the tribute that vice pays to virtue of saying all of the right things conventionally. Nikki Haley got up and said, America's not a racist country less than 2 minutes after she talked about the Chinese coronavirus.
Yes, no, you're absolutely
like, I can't mince words here. I can't mince words here. She's full of shit. And,
no.
It was Tim Scott did the same thing. Tim Scott got up to be the leading Black voice of, you know, the Trump campaign and lied his ass off about Trump saving historically Black colleges and universities.
Yeah.
These were such cynical, tokenist offerings. But you're right. On evening news, Nikki Haley will get the soundbite that makes her look like a sane person.
Right. Also, best delivered and best, forget facts, because we're talking about the Republicans, forget truth. Just structurally, they were old-fashioned speeches that had beginnings, middle, and end, delivered well, and you could hear them with a few things changed at a convention that nominated Mitt Romney in 2012 or John McCain in 2008.
Right.
I mean, they get a lot of points for coherence and banality.
Right. No.
I don't know how coherent.
That is a lot of what political conventions traditionally are. But to maybe pivot to something that was neither banal nor conventional, I do feel like we would be remiss not to discuss Kimberly Guilfoyle and her boyfriend on the opening night, because that is the party of fear on, I was going to say steroids, but maybe another controlled substance is
going off the rails, I think would be the term.
Indeed.
She had a few bumps, let's say.
Yeah.
Well, this is just not to like drag the previous segment back into this, but this is just what I was going to say to Adam with like, I don't want to put down to cynicism what could be just general incompetence, because, you know, on the final night, you have Rudy Giuliani saying we are on the cusp of a new horrifying dawn that will be birthed in blood. Right. And then Tom Cotton gets up there and says, you're safer now. Everything's great. You know, just like no coordination, even down to the thesis sentence of these speeches.
Yeah. No, it is absolutely. And I was, you know, struck, especially I somehow managed to stay awake through Mike Pence's speech. And the whole thing was framed, you know, first of all, by the criminal appropriation of Fort McHenry as a site, but was also, you know, it did have a beginning, middle, and end, which all pivoted on the Star Spangled Banner. And I, again, as a semi-trained historian, always want to remind people about the racist third verse of the Star Spangled Banner, which is, you know, I forget now, but it's, you know, the hireling and slave will be driven to their graves. It's not subtle. And that all has to do with the history of the moment of the War of 1812, where British general enlisted freed slaves on the British side and went on to occupy the White House. So it seemed like, you know, if we were a country that really paid attention to these things, you know, having rhetorically invoking very carefully and your choice of site and your opening and your closing, a, you know, national anthem that has a racist authoritarian occupying the White House should be made a trickier exercise than it was. That's all I'm saying. But
Chris, I was going to say you did by bringing up the national anthem. It sort of reminds me of my favorite moment that we've all pretended to forget from the RNC, which was Monday morning before any of the festivities really kicked off. They did the roll call to nominate Trump, and they got to Maryland, which was a Civil War border state. And David Bossie, a longtime Trump veteran, campaign veteran, got up to give the presentation. He was supposed to say that Maryland had been a vital conduit for runaway slaves, a home to abolitionists, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. Instead, he said, Maryland is home of the Underground Railroad and two of our greatest segregationists. And he caught himself, and he knew it was such a bad faux pas that he rolled his eyes. And there was just a moment of recognition at the Republican National Convention that
the mask had flipped. And yeah, which is, you know, in a way, going into the general election, the balance that nicely encapsulates, I think, what the balancing act has to be for the Republicans, that it is now a party of white grievance and white militant white privilege, and yet has to do the Nikki Haley, Tim Scott sort of genuflections, you know, God knows. Yeah, I'm unclear on how that's done, especially given, you know, the events in Kenosha, given, you know, what we're now seeing in the sports world. It's a very different, and this is again why it's neither 1968 nor 2016, right? I don't think Trump has any kind of clear path to say, like, I alone will fix it, as he famously did in his 2016 RNC speech. He alone has broken it. I think is perhaps a more cogent way of putting things. One question, sort of maybe to close things out here, is what do we see as the best Democratic, you know, the Biden strategy up to the conventions has been to not interrupt your opponent while he's in the act of self-destruction over COVID, over the economy, over the protests. How much of this messaging do Democrats need to directly counter, and what's the best way that they should go about doing so? Walter, I'll again let you kick.
I'm going to go with more of the same.
Really?
I think it's working. I think the effort to make Biden in the middle of the pandemic hyperactive or to dominate the newscast, let us be honest here. The idea of Joe Biden is a little more compelling than the reality of Joe Biden. Okay. So I am just have them out there enough so the cowering in the basement line doesn't resonate with voters, but right. Don't try to do too much.
What about the reality of Kamala Harris? I mean, I do think,
well, I was fascinated. Trump did not mention her once.
Yeah.
And if the point of a vice president is first, thou shalt do no harm,
right.
Biden has succeeded. In fact, listening to the Tom Cotton speech, I realized what a different speech it would have been if Biden had picked Susan Rice, who was the national security advisor under Obama, as his running mate.
You would have heard something about Benghazi, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, so I think that she can be the traditional attack dog role played by a vice president. God knows she will be more interesting than Tim Kaine.
A low bar, but yes. How about you, Jeb? What do you think as the, you know, to-do list facing Biden and Harris going forward?
I think Walter's right on. The only thing I would add is I think one of the things that's, you know, compelling about Trump, even if you don't like Trump, you see one of his tweets like, you know, the Coca-Cola company doesn't like me, whatever, I'll keep drinking that garbage. And you know, like, that's funny, that's normal. And he occasionally does these sorts of asides. And I kind of wish that Biden and Harris would, and make Trump react to it, of just like, look at these guys. You know, like, how do you reply to, 4 straight days of lying? You just go look at this stuff. What are they going to do? Like, say, well, I insist that this part was true. Make them do the work of making this seem relevant. But if they're going to lie that much, forget it.
Yeah, it's like when at the end of her debate with Loretta Sanchez in the California Senate race, Loretta Sanchez dapped. It was a completely bizarre moment. And you could see Kamala Harris was like, well, do I just sort of lower the boom here? And the moderator had said something like, well, we've seen very different candidates here. And I think in a very smart ploy, Kamala replied, we sure did. That's all you needed to say in that situation. How about you, Adam? What do you think the Democrats need to do to stave off the specter of the smoldering suburbs?
Well, the first thing I want to point out is that I don't think that the Republican Party was prepared for this ticket. And if you look at all the socialism, anarchism rhetoric, it was really seemingly tailored to a Bernie Sanders candidacy. And I really feel like they were so prepared for Bernie, and they had I was saying before we got on, it was like they were buying everything for a gender reveal party, but forgot how to read an ultrasound. So I do think that they're going to have trouble pushing that particular angle.
Yeah, the image of raving socialist Joe Biden coming for your backyard grill is a hard one to carry off. That
said, I do think that speaking as somebody who was in San Francisco when she was the AG, I do think that the Republican Party, whether it will succeed or not, will position Harris as their Hillary Clinton. Right. When I spoke to young African American voting age men in Broward, in my home here in South Florida, in election week, they all were planning on sitting it out because, well, Hillary, like, what the hell do I have to do with Hillary? She is anti-Black, super predators. They had all heard the radio ads that Trump was running. And I think that Harris faces a lot of that same pressure from the decisions that she's made to prosecute people for pot and for school truancy. That said, she's telling a compelling story right now. She's a historical candidate. She's risen to the moment in a lot of ways and certainly changed some of my mind. I do think, however, that you're going to see that as a major angle of attack. And even if they want to persist with this idea of kind of Joe as the grandfatherly caretaker of the Republic and Harris as the future of the Republic, they're going to have to kind of contend with, well, is she really the future or is she just another establishment? I think they can answer it, but Jeb and I live in Florida, so we've seen what wall-to-wall ads full of hate-mongering crap can do for a DeSantis or a Rick Scott.
Yeah. Although I will say, I think she has kind of the Obama advantage. Like, Obama could be to the African-American community the scold in chief and still get an historic turnout because, I mean, just the identity of just the recognition that this candidate, when he goes outside and he walks down the street, is going to get harassed like me. I mean, there's that. Harris still has that in the pocket, no matter how, zealous she has been in terms of like being a law enforcement officer. Yeah, there is that recognition that she's as much a victim of the same apparatus that she once used. And I think it just hits a wall. I think it has to.
Yeah. And she also is, she's offering agency in some form to Asian Americans who have always been sort of an invisible factor in American politics.
No, that's a good point, I think. Absolutely. So. We're now past our appointed time. So I'm going to throw the floor open to some questions, of which we have many. Let me see. Okay. This is a good sort of more of a statement, but I do think it goes to the events of the past week. A reader or viewer named Susan asked, what about the hypocrisy of whites like the McCluskeys brandishing their guns to protect their property versus a Black person needing to be shot, even, usually unarmed because they're defined as a threat. We see that with Jacob Blake, who right-wing media has rushed to say that there was a knife in his car, which, you know, when you shoot a guy outside of his car, I don't think that's probable cause. But there is, you know, and again, the Rittenhouse case to me is shocking, and I think I am frankly scared of what it represents for the road ahead of, you know, people on the right. Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter have, you know, sort of embraced him as a defender of this embattled country that is being conjured in the RNC, and that is a really terrifying development. So Adam, you're the gun expert. I'll let you kick off.
I mean, what it comes down to is you're seeing an active encouragement and a rise of black shirtism in America, and that's what Rittenhouse essentially was. A 17-year-old who can't purchase a long gun legally under federal and state laws, who transported it over state lines with his mom to act as a vigilante in the streets, and was defended for being a multiple killer in one night. Republicans and conservatives have exploded the twice as good thesis of being a person of color in the United States. They're explicitly telling you being twice as good isn't enough.
Right.
You can't be good enough.
Yeah.
I think of Philando Castile, who was a law-abiding concealed carry permit holder who was shot in his dead in his car in front of his girlfriend on video by a cop, because we have institutionalized the idea that a black man and the possibility of a weapon poses an inherent existential threat. I've covered Stand Your Ground, and it's just, this has been trending for, I mean, 2010, I think, was really the rise, like about midway through the first Obama term was when you started to see a kind of rise of grassroots conservative reactionary militancy with firearms. These chickens are coming home to roost, and they are extremely well armed.
Yes. Walter, do you have anything to add there?
Not really, just in the interest of time.
Yes. So I actually lost my Q&A roster here, so bear with me one moment. A lot of these are actually from the same person. An anonymous attendee asks, isn't the level of craziness that we've seen over the past week at bottom about a willingness to be uninformed? Which speaks volumes about our lack of respect for knowledge. I would add, perhaps, that it also speaks to the failure of our media ecosystem, which we briefly discussed, and big unregulated monopoly in the room named Facebook. But Walter, since you declined the last question, I'll let you kick off this stuff.
Let me try on this one. One of the things that really struck me is how much time Trump devoted to tariffs and his tariff war last night. Mm-hmm. That this took up a large chunk of the speech. And it was basically said under the backdrop of almost no one understands that the new trade treaty with Canada and Mexico is the old trade treaty with a new name, or the trade war with China really shot us in the foot more than it hurt China. But the point is that to 98% of the American electorate, these are words, and you have no way of checking this. What is striking about the situation right now is when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to paying your rent next week, you have lots of ways of checking the reality that Donald Trump claimed last night. And when that reality, your reality, collides with the Trump reality, it sort of underscores that the whole Trump alternate worldview really will not survive long once you're talking about issues a little more concrete to your average American than the mythical wall that Trump supposedly built.
Right. No, and Dan Kaufman, actually, a friend of mine, has a great piece in the New Yorker a couple of issues back on Wisconsin, which he writes about, and how the China trade war has really ravaged the rural economy there. That was a belt of voters that went strongly for Trump in 2016. And they, it's early times yet, but they flipped a lot of Republican seats in 2018 in that region. And, polling suggests that it's going to be, hard for Trump to reclaim that ground. So, Jeb, do you have any, I think of you as a media expert by default, thoughts on, the distorted fields of knowledge and flows of information that have, I think both produced Trump and Trump gleefully exploits?
Like, it's a feeling I had in the 2016 election, watching people sort of be abusive to each other, that for a lot of people, I think it comes down to a coin flip over what socially permissible abuse they can engage in to feel like a dynamic and active, contributing part of the political process. And I think, that sort of choose your own adventure quality to QAnon of, well, I'll find out that there's some truth out there. I think that is just a modified, obviously less educated in terms of media diet version of like what the blogosphere, like the liberal blogosphere did in 2004 to 2008 of like, let's expand these new properties of talking about politics. We'll find out the ones that we consider respectable and we'll stick with it. And I don't know. I think that impulse will survive Trumpism just because of the sort of sclerotic nature of politics. Like there is something to blame for the fact that we can't move forward and achieve something. And the fact that it empowers you as the reader, you are the person who makes the discovery. You're the person.
Right. And you're debunking all these lies you're being fed by elites and remote sinister forces.
Well, also, I will add too that sort of the sinister, the back end that we think of like the really negative consequences, like people in real life, I think don't necessarily agree with that. Like there's a QAnon guy in my neighborhood. I saw, Q sticker on a Toyota Tacoma and had a little cold, like pour down my back when I saw it. But, from everybody who knows him, like a completely affable, nonviolent person. And who I think doesn't believe in the ultimate tale of like, well, JFK Jr. faked his own death to join with Robert Mueller to get on a message board where girls used to submit underage, unrestricted nudes and finally stop sex trafficking. Like they don't care about that, but the idea that there is like, let's say an information war arrayed against them, that is validated every day.
Right. No. It feeds into a kind of solitary victim ideology that I think is really critical in all this. Unfortunately, I think we have to start to wrap up, and I just wanted to give everyone here a chance to offer a closing statement as we would in a debate. So Mr. Weinstein, the first delegate from Florida, you want to give us some walkout thoughts? Oh, you're on mute.
Other than that, I don't share a whole lot of optimism about the way out of all of this misinformation and sort of fascism. You cannot look at this convention and the people that they put up as the Republican Party's future and not be deeply concerned for the future. Whether you talk about Haley or Scott or Rand Paul, the folksy libertarian who wants libertarianism for white guys and a police state for everybody else. Tom Cotton, I can't say anything about. That's not a extremely blue language. And then Mike Pompeo, who has probably done more to crap on the reputation of West Point than any alumnus since Jefferson Davis.
I can tell.
This party is screwed, but they will continue to persist because the grift is strong and the money is good.
Right. Jeb, do you have any closing thoughts to add?
I think the thing, I mean, there's a couple, but just to pick one, reading the discourse these last 4 years, I think a lot of people have been waiting for their Reichstag fire, right? There's going to be an overt act, and the way that it got framed at the convention and has been framed, and the way that it just sort of returns to as this grievance. And I really do think that, the Reichstag fire already happened. It was the 2016 election interference, and scuttling out from under that is every pretext for the authoritarianism that you see in Germany in 33, right? Like the DOJ is investigating the investigators.
Right.
We're getting rid of our inspectors general, right? Like that, that it is rooted so deeply that was, I think, the one theme that really kind of came through no matter what they tried, which is that, we are at the silent war. We've already had this revolutionary act, and all we're seeing now on the streets are elaborations of this same conflict that has been happening in the twilight.
Right. Well, that's a cheerful thought. How about you, Walter?
I'm going to be Mr. Cheerful.
Oh, good.
What struck me from this week is that the Republicans squandered 4 days, that they did not change the contours of this election, that they did not define Biden in a way that was different from he was defined before this.
Right.
And the fact that they had no affirmative message other than Donald Trump in secret is a lovable guy and told only by relatives. And they're running out of time. People are going to be voting in 6 weeks. And the fact is that for all the fears of Trumpism, they keep not being able to figure out how to run against Joe Biden this year. And they have no idea what to say to offer hope about the future.
All right, that is a cheerful note. And I think we better end it quick before anyone else has a different thought. So thank you all very much, panelists, and thank you all for tuning in.